Welcome back. In this lecture of environmental ethics, I wish to take a lot of the different ideas we've been exploring and really combining them together into a central view about environmental ethics so that we can see how the main focus of consequential ethics are different than the agency-based ethics. Bearing that difference in mind, I want to go ahead and start with the consequentialist view. And we have a lot of literature to kind of go through about this, but our main two focuses are going to be on the Dust Bowl as well as the reading by Jared Diamond about Easter Island. If you look at the chain of events that happened on Easter Island, it sets a pattern for what we're going to look at in a couple of other places. So if you can look at this slide for a moment, you'll see right away that there is this very intricate kind of system that Diamond sets up in the reading about what actually happens on Easter Island. So he starts off by saying that Easter Island itself is a very remote location. It's 2,000 miles away from any land in any direction. And the people who settle Easter Island, they discover it as a paradise. It has all these different forms of trees, all these different native species of birds. And so it's in a lot of ways a very unique island because of its remote location, but also because it's able to thrive when people first get to it. And what we can see is there's this kind of series of chain events that happen that are very detrimental to the growth of the island or the development of the people on the island. And one of the first things that he explores or talks about is the introduction of rats from ships. So one of the main ecological factors of the island is that these birds spread seeds throughout the island. They pick at the fruits, and the seeds fall from their beaks all across the island, and this helps kind of repopulate the island. And so the introduction of these rats to the island, what it initially does, that's somewhat detrimental, is that the rats eat the seeds from these trees. And so it doesn't allow for the repopulation of the forest in the way that people had been used to. People use the forest itself for a number of different purposes, but obviously the use of the forest for rafts is a big part of the kind of economics of Easter Island. As he points out, the early kind of excavations of the island show that the early islanders definitely fished for a lot of their food. Something I think it was in the range of 60% of the diet consisted of porpoises, which are basically dolphins, right? And that as time goes on and the forest becomes more scarce, the food source starts to change based off of the scarcity of the rafts themselves. The forest is also important because it helps build the statues that Easter Island is well known for, and being able to get the right kind of tools, getting the rope and things like that, is also a big part of having the forest. And so as fewer trees exist, this starts to create a problem because birds themselves have to start being more competitive over the tree space, and this leads to more birds being grounded. And as those birds become more grounded, the rats start eating more birds, which makes kind of a double whammy for the islanders who, again, are not going out as much because they have fewer rafts. And so they too are in some ways in competition with the rats of who can eat from the bird population. And as this is going on, this of course is creating a rapid decrease in the spread of the seeds of the island itself. So you're getting even fewer trees at a rate which they're maybe most needed. And so when the deforestation completely occurs, right, when it disappears away, right, this means that there are no more rafts, and so there are no more statues. And as Diamond points out, this is the beginning of the decay of the social order, because since there's no more sailing, there's no more organization of resources. People start to not believe in the religious systems that they had previously. They stop believing in the superiority of the chieftains, and this starts to just, in one way or another, create this kind of anarchy on the island. The birds disappear because the people and the rats have eaten them all, and so and of course, since there's no forest for them to be naturally protected in, it doesn't take long with the disappearance of the forest for the birds to disappear. And of course, the people who need some source of protein start eating all of the rats. And Diamond points out that when the rats finally disappear, people start eating each other. And it's this very interesting succession of events where one little mark in the chain causes a bigger mark a little bit later down, until finally all the links are just fully separated out. And what I think is interesting about this idea that Diamond talks about is the point that he's making about how change happens from generation to generation, and one generation can notice the difference that's happening. They can see it, but in the aggregate, it gets much worse. And you may see changes that are different than what the next generation coming up is going to be able to see, because you have experienced more resources. The same way that your grandparents probably experienced more resources than you did. And looking at this, what Diamond's pointing out is that this change, right, we think of as happening like in an instant, right? Like all the trees disappeared from Easter Island in a single year or something along those lines. But what Diamond points out is that there's this paradise that these explorers find and eventually settle on, and it doesn't happen. It doesn't disappear in a single generation, right? You go from having everything to having nothing. Instead, it's this succession of minute and smaller changes that lead to bigger problems that eventually lead to the catastrophe that he's describing about Easter Island. If we look at the Dust Bowl, a similar dynamic is at play in the Dust Bowl. We don't go from there being this kind of bountiful land where people can farm to, right, being hit with 34 dust storms in a single year. Instead, it's this kind of slow progression that starts to take off in this exponential growth over time. And so, if you look at the beginning of this documentary, one of the points that's made is that farmers in the beginning are using a team of horses. They're plowing with horses. And growing up, I remember, because my grandpa lived in Missouri during this time period. I remember hearing stories that he would tell about people who, even when they owned tractors, they would in the beginning use mules or teams of horses because the fuel cost, right, was just too much for them, and the labor cost of making your children go out and plow the fields doesn't really cost you anything. But over time, what we see happen is that the team of horses gets replaced by these tractors because they are faster and more efficient and able to dig up significantly more land. What you see from that point is exactly what the documentary talks about, is this big push from different states to get more farmers in their area. You have those, suitcase farmers, as they called them in the documentary, people who go to speculate on the cost of wheat, and they go in, they pay the farmers money to bring in a good crop, and over time you have this major kind of economy that's booming from just farmers plowing up the land. And of course, the consequence ends up being that all of this dust is free and it starts blowing off the plains. And it gets at a higher magnitude each year, a little bit more. And so, in the 20s is where they replace or start to replace the team of horses with the tractors. But the 30s is when this really happens. And I don't know if you noticed in the documentary, but it talks about having like 9 major dust storms and then 14 major dust storms, right? And in 1934, there's that time period they talk about, that Black Friday, where in April, for the whole month, right, it just kept going. It never absolutely ended at any point in time. And again, just in the time that we're in right now with COVID, this isn't as hard to imagine as years pass, right? But imagine being trapped in your house for 30 days because the dust and the wind are blowing so hard all the time. And of course, some of the consequences that come out of that, as they show in the documentary, is that the birds start using, if you look at that top left image, right, they start using that barbed wire nest because there's no leaves on the land. And so the only way that they can lay their eggs is in this barbed wire, which just absolutely blows my mind. The jackrabbit hunts that they had to do, where the guy was talking about, they used shotguns, right, but they realized that wasn't a very good idea, and so they started forming these lines where they would club these rabbits to death. And there's just so many of these rabbits that come by. And so if we look at it, all of these different problems stem from this main one. And again, if we take Diamond's thinking about this, this isn't something that happens in a single instant. Like he says, like there isn't someone on the Easter Island who just magically one day chops down the last tree, right? But there's this whole psychology that's behind getting to the point where you need to chop down that last tree, despite the future consequences, where that your way of life is completely destroyed from that moment onward, right? Like there'll never be a chance to plant another tree again when you chop down the last one. And as Diamond points out, that decision is made well before like the last person chops down the final tree. And in the instance of the Dust Bowl, what I think is really interesting here is that you can see the farmers going back and forth between whether or not they're going to change their plowing methods or if they're going to look for a different solution. And so one thing I would point out, I'm going to give a couple other examples here, but one thing I'd point out about consequentialism is that in the end, consequentialism says this is what we have to do. We have to manage the consequences of the situation, because as they start to get more and more out of hand, the problem ultimately becomes too big for us to be able to handle. And so, like in the Easter Islands, right, when people have already made up their minds that they're going to chop down the trees to continue their living, right, you get to a point where that's just not possible because there's no more trees to chop down. And in the instance of the Dust Bowl, it could have well been the case the farmers chose to never change their plowing methods, and it probably would have taken less than the remaining time of that drought to wipe out the remaining part of the lands. Because a lot of the things that they're talking about there, having to go around and shooting all of the cattle because there's not enough food left for it, right? Having to shoot all of the hogs. For the same reason, having no speck of land left to be able to grow watermelons or anything else like that, because the static electricity is frying everything that's growing, because the dust storms are just too much to bear. All of those things have to do with managing the consequences of the actions the right way. And so by changing the plowing methods, you change the consequences that your previous plowing methods held. And that's one of the main ideas in consequentialist thinking. If we compare the chain of events that happen to the chain of events that happened in Easter Island, again, this is just a really quick kind of like breakdown, right? But you go from the 1920s, where you have people speculating on wheat and it being this very kind of prosperous time, to the massive plow of the Southwest Plains. And from 1930 to 1937 is where all the major dust storms hit. 32 to 34 is the absolute worst parts. But from 30 to 37, there's not really any major reform that's happening during this time period. And you have some people who are just doubling down, right? Who create that last man's club, and they're like, until hell freezes over, we're going to stay on this land. Sorry, I think I said 34, but 35 is actually when, right, you have the 30 continuous days of dust blowing, so you can't even go outside. And so, I think, if not to get too close to our topics now, but I think this is really interesting in consideration of what we talk about with mask wearing right now, and people's reluctance to be able to wear masks in connection with the spread of coronavirus, because it follows a very similar kind of trajectory, right? Where in the beginning, people who don't wear masks, they don't really suffer very many consequences from that. In the same way that the people who are, plowing up land with their tractors in the beginning don't really cause a very big issue to happen. Same way that the deforestation of Easter Island at the beginning doesn't really cause a major issue. But as more and more people, plow up the land, as more and more people don't wear masks, the spread of COVID-19 starts to rise exponentially, right? The spread of the dust in the Dust Bowl starts to rise exponentially. The problems on Easter Island with the deforestation of the lands starts to create exponential, right, problems instead of just one or two issues. And so, again, from a consequentialist standpoint, the idea behind this is, well, then you should reform those actions so that you have the consequences that you desire. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a pretty bad situation. If I could point out the relevancy of some of what is being said in Easter Island, I'd like to point you to this graphic that I got about the area of virgin forest land from 1620 to the present day. And again, using that same kind of technique that Diamond talks about of what the land ultimately looks like. You can base that, as he points out, off of a lot of those swamp pole studies, and you can use pollination samples. We're lucky enough that we also have a lot of historical context for what the United States looked like in 1620. But again, there's a number of different ways that we can recreate and understand what the United States looked like. And if you look everywhere where there is a pixel of black in this picture, that's a place where there was a virgin forest in the United States. In fact, every pixel that you see actually represents, as it points out, right, 25,000 acres of virgin forest. And so if you look at this picture here, it shows that, in 1850, we start to look very different than what we did, in 1620. There's still a major outline of what was there in 1620. But again, this is part of the major settlement of the Midwest. This is where we start hearing stories about Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and figures like that. Now, what's interesting is, that's a time period of about 200 years difference, right? 230 years. And so if we hop over to, right, just a little under 100 years here, let's look at the difference. Now, again, you can see based off of the former picture the outline of what this looks like, but you can tell that there's major deforestation that happened between 1850 and 1926. And of course, this has a lot to do with the fact that industrialization kind of swept through the nation during that time period. You have the Transcontinental Railroad that's being built, and so once that is built, you have massive, transportation of different resources. You have a lot of people who start building things out of wood, aside from just the railroad being able to export that itself. You got a lot of wood burning stoves and things like that. And of course, we start investing in things like coal and all of that as well during this time period. If we look at the map for today, again, this shows an accurate kind of footprint of what things looked like beforehand. But let's just look at the map for today. And exactly as Diamond points out, right, the disappearance of the forest itself is something that isn't really thought about as much. Again, you can go from one picture to the other and you can see the outline of the former picture in the next picture. But thinking about the fact that from 1620 to the present day, we've pretty much lost the entire virgin forest in the United States, points to exactly the phenomenon that Jared Diamond's talking about, with how people don't notice from one generation to the next what's really happened to their lands. I want to also show these pictures of the forest in California, but also what the early explorers came across when they first came to see the trees in this area. Because when we think of like virgin forests, right, like we think of the forest that we see now that's just like with trees that have gotten a little bit bigger than what they are. And the fact of the matter is that the people who deforested, not only the Midwest and the South, right, but like the United States, they undertook a very big enterprise. Like the trees that they had to chop down, the forest that they had to clear was a massive thing. And what's remarkable about this is how efficiently and quickly it was done. Like if you ever just try to go and remove a tree stump yourself, right? Like that's one of the most frustrating things that you could ever do in your life. And seeing just how quickly this was done, again from 1620 up to the present day, just a complete transformation. It really is, and I'm not advocating for this, by the way, right? But it is a very remarkable change that occurs. And again, from Diamond's perspective, no generation is immune to this kind of thinking, to this kind of rapid change that happens after not really being able to see it from generation to generation. I would point out, if you look at this map of Louisville for a moment, you can see how Louisville itself has actually undergone a similar kind of transformation. If you look, for instance, I'm just going to kind of draw the outline, right? This is kind of where like old Louisville was for like a large portion of the beginning part of Louisville's like history. And in fact, right, like on the west end, Shively was what was referred to sometimes as a sundown place where a large kind of white population lived there for a while, and really it had a transformation in a couple of different time periods as Louisville began to grow, but particularly as what was known as white flight started to happen, where a lot more white people moved out of Shively and into the eastern kind of like parts of Louisville. You obviously had a bigger African American population moving in. But the size of Louisville didn't change a whole lot up to the 1920s. And then from the 1920s, you start to see these bigger, massive influxes of people, and you start to see a shift of growth, right, towards not just like it's like Smoketown and stuff now, but uh, um, sorry, I should mention I just got that wrong, right? Like Smoketown itself actually grew like before the 1920s, but between the 1850 and 1920s, when a lot of people moving from the South, a lot of African Americans moving from the South settled in there. It increased its population with immigrant kind of population as well. There's Butchertown, right over here, which was in place to take care of a lot of the farms that were bringing in different pigs and things like that. Still kind of operates like that a little bit today. But overall, you start to see this big growth in Louisville, and this expansion from 1920s through the 1990s. As you start to see that expansion, you start to see the increase of this movement, right? From again, the central location towards like a larger kind of highway that's needed to like engulf all of that area. And I'd point out in the 1950s, like this area down through here where like 3rd Street kind of comes off itself, it's also like fairly developed. In fact, the first zoo that Louisville ever had was actually right down here in Colonial Manor. What is Colonial Manor today? You can read about that like sometime. But you see this kind of like growth, and right as it starts to expand even more, this is the outline of what's called outer loop, right through here, right? That's outer loop, and you can see this expansion again of Louisville, where the city is undergoing a bigger and bigger kind of like a growth. And of course, the final outline that we have here, right, is like the major outline of like the city all the way around. And so again, if we go to Diamond's point that like no one sees these kinds of expansions, right? It's generation to generation where this expansion like grows. So it's like if you're part of the generation that's here, right? You don't see the expansion necessarily that happened from here to here, right? Because you're seeing that this is the old, right, and that this is the new here. And so, you certainly probably don't see this expansion, right, or this expansion. And all of those areas are places that have moved further and further out in the city. In fact, if I could take just one final example here, let's look at Southern Indiana itself. I stole this from Google Maps, right? It's all credit goes to Google Maps. But I mean, if you look at this really quick, the like building of like the 2nd Street Bridge, like to what we think of as Brown Station Way, to make this kind of connection to New Albany was the original kind of intent of this break off of 65, right? And we see this emergence of 65 kind of growing bigger as Eastern Parkway kind of parallels a lot of the developments that exist between Brown Station Way and Eastern Parkway in here. And this is more or less the big part, the beginning part of Clarksville. I remember when I used to drive with my grandpa when I was little, right? He would get so frustrated being on East Lewis and Clark Parkway because as we drive by it, he's like, this area right through here, he's like, that never existed, right? He's like, I can just remember when all this used to be fields at one time, and right when I was a little boy, right, none of this existed. And of course, On Lewis and Clark Parkway, when I was growing up, there was like the Green Tree Mall, which was like in this like area, and just all these different restaurants down like a restaurant row and things like that. And so the growth of this highway system itself is interesting because it changed directions, right? It was paralleling the traffic that went through like New Albany itself. And as I'm growing up, it's paralleling the traffic that's going through 65. I used to try and get around Lewis and Clark Parkway by going on this road that no one had ever heard of before, called Veterans Parkway. And I liked doing that because Veterans Parkway was just so dead and there was hardly any businesses there, and it would help me easily get around Clarksville, right towards Jeffersonville or wherever I needed to be, because no one knew about where that was. And of course, as I got older, there was that Chick-fil-A that got built there, right? As long as with Walmart and Cheddar's, they were kind of like the first three things there, and Lowe's, right? Like those things were there. And then, after those three or four businesses were there, you start seeing all these other restaurants coming in, all these other developments. Macy's even offered to buy out the town hall from Clarksville at one point, right? And you just have this massive growth on Veterans Parkway. And today, of course, no fool in their right mind would go on Veterans Parkway to try and escape all of the traffic that's out there because of just how busy that area has become. But that's in parallel to 65, and so right, I don't even recognize this as being the central part of Clarksville because it grew out from there during my grandpa's like time period, right? And I was able to see the growth of this area a whole lot because right, that happened during my time period. I was definitely able to see the growth of this area, and I imagine a lot of you have been familiar with seeing the growth that happens along Veterans Parkway. What's interesting about this growth, though, is that it parallels the development of the highway. And so if I can show you really quick here. Today, the main kind of growth that we're seeing, right, in southern Indiana parallels the development of this new highway system, right, this new bridge that's been developed. And so, right now you can see that, this new Kroger was just built in with a Planet Fitness and another Chick-fil-A and McAllister's on this side. And this area has been somewhat empty, but it has like a McDonald's and El Nepal, right, Jeff's Bakery and stuff. If you look at this whole area right through here, right now, that's undeveloped land, right? All of that is, still on this map green. And I guarantee you that in the next 5 years, you will see a major development through this area, through Utica, right? Like through probably through this portion over here on this side as well. Especially the land, you're already starting to see it develop out now. They're selling crazy high land prices, right? But you'll see all of that develop out like through your lifetime. And while it's happening, you won't think to yourself like, look at the deforestation that's like happening like around us. Look at like the tilling of like the lands. But when the next generation comes after yourself, the development that hasn't happened yet in these areas, but probably most likely will happen, right, will be just a natural part of the next generation's life, right? And so you get to a point at which land becomes scarce, even in a place where there's a lot of land. And so this is Diamond's major fear. Diamond looks at the Earth and he says, really, I have it listed here wrong, right? Really, Easter Island is a miniature version of the Earth, right? The Earth is just like Easter Island in the fact that it's limited in resources. It's remote from other useful resources. It's not really economical right now to be able to mine, asteroids or visit other planets. And so we're kind of remote in the same way that the people on Easter Island were remote from a lot of the different lands as well. It's not to say that there aren't places, further out that have resources that could one day be beneficial. But that, for the technology that we have currently, right, it seems as though there's not a lot of things that we can do to save ourselves. And so, from Diamond's perspective, we have to be able to manage the consequences of our environmental actions if we're going to preserve our own lives. And so, in thinking about that, I think it is worth going back to talking about what we mentioned in the first class in consequentialism about the problem of the paradox of hedonism, where people tend to go after things that are very pleasurable for them, and live these kind of lifestyles that they're able to live as long as they can. And Diamond points out that the chieftains live these kind of lifestyles where they wanted to make these bigger and larger sorts of statues. And in fact, he parallels this to the building of Hollywood mansions right now, where again, average square footage has just increased so much, where in the 1920s, 1930s, a home that had 900 square feet was gigantic for a lot of people, and today that's on the smaller end of homes, where it's not uncommon to see a home that has 2,000, 3,000 square feet being built. And he points out in the Hollywood mansions, you have these like 5,000, 6,000 square feet homes that are being built, and people don't even live in them for most of the time, like throughout the year. And so these homes use up a lot of these different resources. They don't have a great payoff in the sense that people don't live in them very often. And so Diamond's real fear here is that the Earth is ultimately falling to this tragedy of the commons, where people who have the ability to build from great resources and wealth do. And just as we learned about in the paradox of hedonism, if you continuously pursue this pleasure, it eventually is going to catch up with you, and it's going to lead to a very unpleasurable situation. And like it did on Easter Island, right, the chieftains continued to build these statues, right, to their own peril, because eventually, when there was no more forest left, one of the first targets, right, of these people who were hungry and angry that there were no resources left over were the statues, right? Like, why did we spend all of our time and energy building these statues? And instead of them becoming a central part of life, they became a central kind of point of attack where groups of people went through and started throwing them down on the island and trying to break them apart and bust them up. And so if we look at all of this together, again, the central kind of theme about this is that managing the consequences is important for establishing the right kind of environmental ethos. Because, again, if we don't manage the consequences correctly, in fact, if we ignore what's happening around us, then disaster is what's in store. And so going back to the main framework that we used about anthropocentrism, a lot of people might look at that and say, right, I think that's terrible to think that human beings are at the center of environmental policy, because, well, like, what does that do for me, right? In the end, that maybe that makes me a worse person. But people from a consequentialist standpoint would come back and say, this is actually what makes people better. When we look at what actually comes about, right, the consequences of our actions, it helps us to decide how to improve our own actions, how to make our actions better. And ultimately, right, if we want to have an environment that's livable for human beings, right, we have to adapt to the circumstances of our situation in order to make the best of our situation. Now, The other way that we talked about that we can think about environmental ethics is agency-based environmental ethics. And so, we haven't read a whole lot, haven't had to do a whole lot in terms of agency-based environmental ethics, other than the eco-feminist lab that I had you do. But again, the main argument from an agency-based standpoint is, right, what is the relationship that individuals have to whatever dilemma it is that we're looking at. If you could start off, I think this is a helpful construct in trying to think about agency-based ethics for environmental ethics. Is if you could think about this scenario for a moment. Imagine that an alien race comes to Earth and they threaten to enslave all of mankind, and they say that everybody on Earth is just too irrational to be able to learn what's best for themselves. And so in order to make their race better, aliens decide to enslave all of humanity, all human beings, and they will slowly over time use their technology to make human living better, more feasible, but also to serve their interests. What are some of the objections that someone might raise about this particular scenario? Feel free to pause this video if you wish to think about them. Probably the main issue that you would look at is this hindrance of freedom, right? Is to say, well, right, like, why should human beings have to serve anybody? It doesn't seem fair, right? Even if they are technologically more capable than us, right? Why would we serve human beings that are not human beings, aliens, right? That want to enslave human beings. And of course, any argument that you could think of to negate that scenario is the same kind of argument that people would make about our relationship with the environment. Right? Why is it that we as human beings feel we have a right to cage other animals? Why is it that we feel we have a right to use our understanding and our technology to enhance our own living standards without regard for other lives, without regard for the agency of other animals? And if we extend this not just to the discussion about animals, which is an important part of the biocentric view that we were talking about, but we extend it to the environment as a whole, I think it probably makes sense from that framework of seeing why people think that instead of managing the consequences, we should focus on the relationship that we have with the environment. So again, some of the focus and some of the arguments that are used about this really have to deal with, in large portion, right, what kind of relationship evolves when you ignore relationships that you have. So a lot of voices have spoken up about the caging of animals themselves, and what this does, not just from an ecological standpoint towards animals, but also what it does for the welfare of human beings. So if we think about the chickens for a moment, when you put lots of different chickens in close proximity to each other and kind of force them to live in this, unlivable kind of circumstances, inevitably what happens is this kind of cannibalism that results from it. Chickens start pecking each other to death in order to get a little bit more room, in order to, again, that's where we get the term, right, the pecking order, right? But it just creates this, what we might deem unnatural kind of reaction. For pigs, it's also interesting because, a lot of the cages that pigs are placed in, they're not even big enough like to fit the pig. So if you look at this picture, you'll see that, snouts are often kind of going over like the wires of like the cages like themselves. And what we find in a lot of these situations is that, pigs start become more susceptible to disease. They start peeing, on each other, and that often, affects the quality of the meat that people eat. And in general, it starts to become this kind of cesspool for disease that is unmanageable, even for people who are very carnivorous, right, and enjoy a good pork chop. Like it's not good for those human beings either. And so if we go to the kind of beginning portion of what we talked about from a feminist ethics standpoint, there's this idea that like when someone is dominated, right, that leads to this kind of self-destructive pattern. And so we could talk about it in terms of self-destruction of like the cannibalistic nature of the chickens, like as you put them in cages. But we could also talk about it in terms of like self-destruction of the people who are eating the meat that is most likely infected. And it's not a coincidence that we've had to deal with bigger outbreaks of things like E. coli. In some cases, throwing away millions of pounds of meat to ensure that there is no kind of infectious strand that's placed on there. It's not a coincidence that this happens in concert with the rise of these kind of corporate farms that exist. Another argument that can be made in connection with this idea of looking at the relationship one has with the environment is that when that relationship itself is based on this idea of privatization, that is that someone claims ownership over the environment, and that ownership doesn't necessarily have a component of responsibility towards it, but it is a component of exclusion. What ultimately ends up happening is that it makes the deficit between the majority of people even greater, because it ends up making property very expensive in elite places, and it forces people to basically congregate together in these smaller places. The largest growth of human population in the last 20 years has been in a couple of different categories that deal with poverty. The slums are the largest growth of human population in the last 20 years, and you can see this in a lot of different places, throughout South America and Africa and in Eastern Bloc countries. But there's also been a large growth of refugee populations and refugee encampments throughout the world as well. And again, going back to the thinking behind this is that it has a lot to do with the distribution of resources. And so as communities become more privatized, they become more exclusive. And that ultimately benefits a few people and leaves a majority of people out. When you start with the relationship that people have to the environment, it also implies the relationship that people have to one another. And so instead of building off of this premise of I'm going to do like what's in my best interest and my sole best interest, and instead you start from a place of thinking about, well, what is my relationship to everyone else? It changes how people think about things like housing. Like for instance, if we look at even just about 100 years ago, what houses looked like throughout South America. Most of those houses had these kind of additions of places where people would have their children live with them, and when their children became of age to move out, instead of like them moving to a different house, they would just add on to these houses. And so even though you see large houses like that today, the thinking of housing today is like, you become of age, like it's time for you to move out, right? Like get your own place, get your own house. And of course, there wasn't this focus on corporate living, on a cooperative
kind of like family, as opposed to the nuclear family model. One of the other ideas that we could talk about in agency-based ethics is the view that terrorism itself is a product of this what's referred to as economic colonization of resources. In the extended readings that I have, which you are not required to look at, Vandana Shiva, in her essay Earth Democracy, makes this point and many other points along the same lines of pointing out that a lot of different corporations have really thrived on this notion that began during colonization, of the fact that like if you could move in, say, during the Silk Road, and you could gain an economic advantage by displacing people. You could, for instance, shoot a chieftain's daughter, right? And that would cause enough uproar that a corporation could move in and take over a town, use all the people who had belonged to that chieftain as laborers for the corporation. Then it seems worth waging that kind of war. And this is extended into the statehood now, where you see not only these refugee encampments that exist like throughout the world, but you see, similar to the chickens and the pigs that we're talking about, these kind of warehouses, tents a lot of times, that just house people. And the consequence of that, of course, is that a lot of the people are starved in these camps because they don't have enough resources to be able to feed themselves. They don't have the ability to move through and get things. If you look at the bottom right picture there, that's actually a refugee school. And so, if you're going to school like that, what belief do you have that your economic future is stable at all? It's like you're sitting basically on top of each other to be able to fit inside the classroom. And it's like, even if you're excelling in your class there, right? Like there's absolutely no opportunity for growth, no opportunity for resources in a lot of ways. And so what you see is that in a lot of these countries where there is the growth of these slums, where there is people who are literally living on top of each other, you have people who say, well, I have one alternative to this, right? I can go join a group like Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, who will feed me, right, and who will ensure, right, the safety of my family against the corruption of the government that you happen to be living with. And you see a lot of children doing that. In Uganda, there was a big controversy about 10 years ago with the figure Joseph Kony, who this is exactly what he was doing in Uganda. Uganda is one of the poorest countries in the world. So it still is that way. It definitely was 10 years ago. And what Kony was basically doing was going to all of these children who had lost their parents, and looking at the fact that they have absolutely no way of getting fed, no way of getting clothed, and saying, hey, right, I will feed you, I will clothe you, just pledge allegiance to my army, and we'll make it work. And so the idea, again, from an agency-based standpoint, is if we begin with the relationship first, right, and our investment is in what kind of status are people living in, right? What kind of access do they have to resources? How best can we help those individuals? And we extend that out not just to human beings, but to the environment writ large. The idea is that we will have a better management of our resources, because ultimately we're considering that the external factors or the external stressors, at least, that create these sorts of conditions that make things unmanageable with very terrible sorts of consequences. Another idea behind this, and what separates this majorly from a consequentialist point of view, is, again, even me mentioning the fact that consequences are involved may make you say, oh, so is this really a consequentialist point of view? is this idea about the interconnectivity of all living creatures. You can look at any ecosystem and you'll see that there is a complex web of interactions right within that ecosystem. And in fact, all ecosystems themselves are interdependent upon other ecosystems that exist. So you can look at, for instance, in this picture, the function of algae, and say, okay, well, that seems pretty linear, right? Like the algae are just helping, right? Feed the crabs, right? And maybe a source of vegetation for a few other things. But actually, like if you look at this, once you take the algae out of the equation, it's like taking the trees out of Easter Island. It causes the rest of the ecosystem to fully collapse. And so that's one of the major differences of agency-based ethics versus consequentialist-based ethics, is that we really want to look at the complexity of the relationships between all different creatures. And so if we're talking about environmental ethics here, we have to be mindful of the fact that just our own reaction towards something causes this kind of chain reaction of events. If we could go back to the Dust Bowl for a moment, I think probably one of the best examples of that is actually the example of the jackrabbits. I imagine nobody thought of the fact that as more land disappears and less grass exists, that there could possibly be that many jackrabbits that would just come like flying out of the lands to try and change, or not try and change the landscape, but ultimately, change what was happening to the land itself. The last main argument I would make about agency-based ethics has a lot to do with the fact that it stands to reason we have probably not discovered all the different ways in which relationships can evolve in nature. And looking at that, the main point of doing the Ecofeminist Lab was to see some of the parts of the interconnectedness within systems to not only human beings, but also between other animals as well. If you look at this slide, you'll see a number of ways in which there are what I have called symbiotic relationships with other animals that exist. And again, we haven't fully unraveled or tapped all of the potential that exists. Probably the most iconic picture on this slide is the one on the top right, where the man is hugging the lion. And you can think of someone who would make the argument, and in fact, I probably would have made this argument a long time ago, right? That lions by nature are these like predators, like these hunters, and they do not have compassion, right, in them. Like a lion is a lion. And what I think is really interesting, you can look this video up if you want. It's called The Lion Tamer, where this man grew up with lions, helped nurse lions that had suffered from major bouts of depression, from loss of different family members, things like that. Right, helped kind of nurse this lion back to health. Many years later came back out to the wild, and the lion, like full on, came running up to it, gave him this really big kind of hug. And I would point out, if you look around on the rest of this slide, the potential of animals is far greater than anything that we understand at this point. At the bottom right, I have a picture of Koko, the signing gorilla, and there's a lot of controversy about whether or not gorillas can actually sign. One of the main arguments that's made with that is that no gorilla has actually ever, using sign language, ever asked like an inquisitive question before. And I urge you, if you're interested in that, to look up a little bit more about the controversy surrounding that.
But hypnotherapy is a real thing, and it's it's something that has the potential to be a big economic factor in Kentucky, because there's so few places that actually have a large kind of horse population the way that Kentucky does. And as you can see from the advertisement there, it's talking about its advancement with autism and ADHD, and they're starting to also think that maybe the gait of a Missouri Foxtrotter could help people who have underdeveloped brains that also have psychosis with things like reactive attachment disorder, maybe helping them get a better handle on things. If you look at the middle kind of picture there, this is actually from the San Diego Zoo, where that they've had this pair grouped together for a couple of years, and it creates, again, this kind of symbiotic relationship between the two animals. It's explored a lot in this book called The Underdogs, which I cannot recommend too much, but it talks about how dogs themselves have this kind of innate ability, which I was hoping that you would be able to see with the vet, to help people, and some of that's based off of the ability of canines to be able to smell the kind of chemical releases that happen in our bodies. And so they're actually more aware in some situations of chemical changes within people's bodies than people are, right, like themselves. And this is very useful for people who have violent episodes or high suicidal risks with major bouts of depression. When a dog is trained to be able to sense that in people, they can use things like pressure sensitivity, right? Doing things like putting their paws on top of people, licking people's fingers, putting pressure on their chests, right, by being trained to sit down on people. And again, this, as I was hoping you'd be able to see in the vet video, not just a one-way street where it's just fully beneficial towards humans, but it's also beneficial towards the animals themselves. And as we learn more about the animal kingdom, you can see a way in which this is a biocentric argument, because it implies the connectivity of all of life, and we can see how having a better relationship with other animals, not just thinking of them as meat on our plate, but actually having a real relationship with animals can change ultimately how we think what the right thing to do is with animals. But we can also consider this from again the larger standpoint about the environment itself, and like, should we be using oil, right, just to make plastics and make our cars like run, or right, is there maybe a future benefit where we should be more mindful of how like we're using oil? Like, should we think differently about like how we use things like single-use plastic? And as you saw, it gets in the ocean and contaminates things like the milk of whales, so that we reduce the number of whales that are able to give birth. And just a number of different questions that can arise when we look at this from the standpoint of what is our relationship to the environment, as opposed to how do we manage the consequences of our environmental actions. I hope this has been an informative discussion for you, and have a wonderful day.